Korean Airlines Flight 07, a scheduled commercial flight from New York City to Seoul via Anchorage, Alaska, became one of the most tragic and geopolitically significant aviation disasters in modern history. On September 1, 1983, the Boeing 747-230B aircraft operating this flight was shot down by a Soviet Su-15 interceptor after inadvertently straying into prohibited Soviet airspace. All 269 passengers and crew members aboard were killed, including U.S. Congressman Larry McDonald. The incident not only caused immense loss of life, but also intensified Cold War tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union, eventually prompting critical changes in global aviation navigation practices, including the release of GPS technology for civilian use. The aircraft involved in the incident was a Boeing 747-230B, a wide-body commercial airliner manufactured by Boeing. The 747 series had revolutionized air travel with its capacity and range, making long-haul international flights more feasible and economical. On the day of the incident, Flight 07 was scheduled to fly from John F. Kennedy International Airport in New York City to Gimpo International Airport in Seoul, South Korea. The flight included a scheduled stopover in Anchorage, where the aircraft would refuel and switch flight crews before proceeding on the final leg to Seoul. The route taken by Flight 007 was a standard international air corridor known as R20, which ran from Anchorage to Tokyo and was heavily trafficked by commercial aircraft. However, at some point during the flight, a critical navigational error occurred, causing the aircraft to deviate significantly from its assigned flight path. This deviation led the aircraft to enter restricted Soviet airspace over the Kamchatka Peninsula and later Sakhalin Island, regions of considerable strategic importance to the Soviet Union due to the presence of military installations. The flight's deviation went undetected by the flight crew for an extended period, a factor that has been attributed to a combination of mechanical and human errors. It is widely believed that the aircraft's inertial navigation system, INS, was not properly engaged after departing from Anchorage. Instead of following the assigned flight path along R20, the aircraft slowly drifted off course in a parallel trajectory, gradually encroaching into Soviet airspace without the knowledge of the flight crew. The autopilot maintained a constant heading based on the last recorded position, and without proper monitoring and cross-checking by the crew, the error compounded over time. As Flight 007 strayed further into Soviet territory, it triggered a series of alerts within the Soviet air defense network. The Soviet Union, highly sensitive to any potential incursions into its airspace during the height of the Cold War, quickly mobilized its military response. Radar installations tracked the aircraft as it approached Kamchatka, but due to the remote location and limitations in radar coverage, the initial response was slow and uncoordinated. As the aircraft continued its unauthorized trajectory, Soviet forces scrambled fighter jets to intercept the unknown intruder. By the time the aircraft reached Sakhalin Island, Soviet interceptors had visually identified the target as a commercial airliner, but the pilots remained uncertain about its intentions. Communications between the interceptors and Soviet ground control reveal a chaotic and tense situation, with conflicting orders and a growing urgency to take decisive action. The interceptors attempted to signal the aircraft using standard visual cues, including wing waggling and firing warning shots, but the flight crew of Flight 007 did not respond. It is likely that they were unaware of the interceptor's presence and did not interpret the signals as a threat. Eventually, under orders from Soviet military command, one of the Su-15 interceptors fired 2 air-to-air missiles at the Boeing 747. The missiles struck the aircraft, causing catastrophic damage. Flight 007 began to break apart in mid-air and crashed into the Sea of Japan near Moneron Island, west of Sakhalin. There were no survivors among the 269 passengers and crew members. The victims included citizens from multiple countries, with a significant number of South Koreans and Americans among the dead. U.S. Congressman Larry McDonald, a staunch anti-communist and vocal critic of the Soviet Union, was also aboard the flight, adding a politically explosive dimension to the tragedy. The immediate aftermath of the shoot-down was marked by global outrage and condemnation. The United States, under President Ronald Reagan, denounced the attack as a brutal and senseless act of aggression. The Soviet Union, initially evasive about its role in the incident, eventually admitted to shooting down the aircraft, but maintained that it had been operating in self-defense against what it believed to be a spy plane. The Soviet narrative claimed that the aircraft had deliberately violated its airspace and ignored repeated warnings, leaving them with no choice but to act. International organizations and aviation authorities launched investigations into the incident, seeking to understand how a civilian aircraft could stray so far off course and be mistaken for a military threat. The International Civil Aviation Organization, ICAO, played a central role in analyzing flight data and reviewing air traffic control communications. Although the Soviet Union did not fully cooperate with the investigation, data from radar tracking and intercepted communications provided a compelling picture of the events leading up to the shoot-down. One of the most profound outcomes of the incident was the recognition of vulnerabilities in the global air navigation system. The lack of real-time tracking and the reliance on inertial navigation systems, which could drift over time without manual correction, were identified as key weaknesses. In response to the tragedy, President Reagan announced that the Global Positioning System, GPS, which had been developed for military use, would be made available for civilian aviation and navigation. This decision marked a turning point in the democratization of satellite navigation technology and laid the groundwork for the GPS services that are now integral to global transportation and communication. The geopolitical consequences of the shoot-down were far-reaching. Relations between the United States and the Soviet Union, already strained by ideological rivalry and an escalating arms race, deteriorated further. The incident reinforced perceptions of Soviet hostility and unpredictability, galvanizing public opinion in the West and prompting renewed calls for military preparedness and strategic deterrence. The Reagan administration used the incident to justify increased defense spending and to bolster support for NATO and other allied commitments. In the Soviet Union, the incident was handled with a combination of secrecy and propaganda. The government sought to control the narrative by portraying the shoot-down as a necessary act of defense against Western espionage. Soviet media outlets disseminated disinformation suggesting that the aircraft had been on a reconnaissance mission, and the identities of the victims were downplayed or obscured. Internally, the incident sparked debate within the Soviet military and political establishment about the handling of airspace incursions and the protocols for engaging unidentified aircraft. The families of the victims faced immense grief and frustration, compounded by the lack of information and the slow pace of recovery efforts. The remote location of the crash site and the refusal of the Soviet Union to allow international recovery teams access to the area hindered the retrieval of wreckage and remains. In the absence of physical evidence and comprehensive official reports, many questions about the final moments of Flight 007 remained unanswered for years. Over time, declassified documents and the eventual release of cockpit voice recordings and flight data shed more light on the incident. The transcripts revealed that the flight crew had been unaware of their deviation from the flight path and had not received any warnings or alerts that would have prompted corrective action. The tragic irony of the situation was that a combination of technical malfunction, human error, and miscommunication led to a fatal confrontation between a civilian aircraft and a superpower's military defense system. The legacy of Korean Airlines Flight 007 endures as a sobering reminder of the dangers inherent in an interconnected and heavily militarized world. It highlighted the importance of robust communication protocols, accurate navigation systems, and restraint in the use of military force. The reforms that followed, particularly the expansion of GPS access, have had a lasting impact on global aviation safety and navigation. In South Korea and the United States, memorials were erected to honor the victims, and the incident remains a poignant chapter in the history of the Cold War. The names of the passengers and crew are remembered in ceremonies and tributes, and their loss continues to resonate with those who advocate for transparency, accountability, and peace in international relations. The story of Flight 007 serves not only as a historical case study, but also as a moral lesson about the cost of misjudgment, the fragility of life, and the imperative to safeguard civilian lives, even amidst geopolitical conflict. As historians and aviation experts continue to analyze the incident, new perspectives and insights emerge. Some have examined the psychological and institutional factors that influenced the Soviet response, while others have explored the broader context of US-Soviet relations and the strategic calculus of both sides. The complexity of the situation defies easy answers, but the consensus remains that the shoot-down of Flight 007 was a tragedy that could have been averted with better systems, clearer communication, and a greater commitment to human life. In the years since the incident, commercial aviation has undergone significant improvements in safety protocols, airspace monitoring, and international cooperation. Technologies such as satellite-based navigation, automated flight tracking, and real-time communication have reduced the likelihood of similar incidents occurring in the future. Nonetheless, the lessons of Flight 007 remain relevant, particularly in a world where geopolitical tensions and military capabilities continue to pose risks to civilian populations. The memory of Korean Airlines. Flight 007 endures not only in the annals of aviation history, but also in the collective conscience of a world striving to balance security with humanity. It is a story of error and consequence, of lives lost and lessons learned, and of a moment when the divisions of the Cold War claimed the innocent and challenged the world to do better. Thanks for watching. If you found this video helpful, don't forget to share it with your friends and hit that subscribe button for more content like this.